Today I bring you a narrative about Esperanza Morales, a young woman considered ugly by the society of 1852, who found herself promised to a widowed and mourning duke. But this is not just a story of an arranged marriage. It's a journey about dignity, transformation, and the discovery that true beauty resides where we least expect to find it. Between abandoned gardens, guarded secrets, and a love that blooms in silence, Esperanza will show us that we don't need to beg for crumbs of affection when we deserve a banquet of respect. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Leave your city or country in the comments. I love knowing that our stories reach distant hearts. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave that loving like. It helps me so much to continue bringing these special narratives to you. Puebla de Los Angeles, Mexico, year 1852. The rain drummed against the windows of the Morales family oratory like tears that no one dared to shed. Esperanza kept her hands intertwined, her pale fingers contrasting with the pearl-grey silk of her wedding dress, modest, without brilliance, chosen by Doña Remedios de Morales y Vega so as not to offend the eyes of those present. At 19, Esperanza carried the cruel mark of being called the ugly one of the family. Her brown hair, rebellious to hairpins, framed an angular face that had never inspired sonnets or sighs. Her almond-shaped eyes, however, held a depth that the mirrors in the salons had never known how to reflect. Don Alejandro de la Torre, Duke del Mirador, remained erect at the altar like a bronze statue. At 35, he still wore the strict mourning for his wife who had died 2 years ago. His blue-grey eyes did not rest on Esperanza. They fixed on an indefinite point beyond the walls, as if his soul inhabited another place, another time. The priest murmured the sacred words in a monotonous cadence. There were no flowers, no music, no guests, only anonymous witnesses fulfilling a protocol. The marriage had been arranged by Doña Remedios, who saw in the union a providential way to get rid of her charmless niece. "Do you take as husband?" Esperanza's voice sounded clear in the silence, surprising herself. There was no tremor, no hesitation. If destiny delivered her to a man who saw her as a burden, she would at least preserve her dignity. Alejandro repeated the vows with the same indifference with which he would sign a commercial contract. When their hands touched for the exchange of rings, Esperanza felt the coldness of fingers that seemed never to have known human warmth. The ceremony ended without a kiss, without embraces, without tears of joy. Doña Remedios lightly kissed her niece's forehead, whispering, "May God make you useful to this house, since nature denied you other gifts." Esperanza did not respond. Her eyes met one last time the image of the Virgin of Guadalupe on the altar, as if seeking a blessing that human words could not offer. Outside, the rain continued its melancholic dance, washing the ancient stones of Puebla, as if trying to purify the world of its small cruelties. What secrets awaited Esperanza in the shadowy hacienda of her new husband? The carriage swayed along the red earth paths that serpentined between agaves and prickly pears, heading toward the valley where Hacienda El Mirador rose. 3 hours of travel in absolute silence. Alejandro read documents. Esperanza contemplated the landscape that became increasingly desolate. When El Mirador emerged between cypresses and mist, Esperanza felt a tightness in her chest. The grey stone mansion rose like a sleeping giant, with its elongated windows that seemed like half-closed eyes. Octagonal towers crowned the corners of the construction, and a central courtyard hid behind shadowy arcades. "Your new home," said Alejandro, breaking the silence for the first time. His voice sounded as distant as the echo in the empty corridors she would soon know. The carriage stopped before the main gate, adorned with the De la Torre coat of arms, an ivory tower on a blue field, surrounded by wheat spikes. Esperanza descended alone. Alejandro was already walking toward the stables, as if her presence were a minor detail to be resolved by the servants. Soledad, the housekeeper, emerged from the shadows of the main atrium. She was a middle-aged woman, thin as a dry branch, with graying hair pulled into a severe bun. Her small, penetrating eyes examined Esperanza from head to toe in an evaluation that clearly resulted in disappointment. "Welcome to the hacienda, señora," she said with a protocolar reverence. "Don Alejandro has determined that you occupy the south wing. Your quarters have been prepared according to instructions." Esperanza followed Soledad through endless corridors, decorated with faded tapestries and portraits of ancestors, with severe gazes. Her steps echoed on the cold marble, creating a symphony of solitude that would seem eternal. "Meals are served at 8, noon, and 7 in the evening," continued Soledad without looking back. "The children take their meals separately, with the governess. Don Alejandro rarely joins family meals." Children. Esperanza knew that Alejandro had a son from his first marriage, but she hadn't imagined she would be kept away from him as well. The quarters destined for her were situated in a lateral tower, far from the main bedrooms. The room was austere but dignifiedly furnished, a dark wood bed, a writing desk by the window, an old wardrobe, and a small oratory. The window overlooked gardens that must have once been magnificent, but now were lost among weeds and wild rose bushes. "The late Duchess loved these gardens," murmured Soledad, following Esperanza's gaze. "No one touches them since then." Don Alejandro so ordered. Esperanza nodded in silence. On the main wall of the room she noticed a lighter rectangle on the wallpaper. There had been a painting that was removed. She didn't ask about this. Some questions carry answers we prefer to discover alone. When Soledad withdrew, Esperanza was alone with the weight of her new reality. Through the window, the afternoon shadows began to lengthen over the abandoned gardens, and she wondered if she too would become another forgotten relic in that house of memories. What had happened to the first Duchess, and why did her memory seem to govern El Mirador even after death? The first days at El Mirador passed in a routine of meticulously organized solitude. Esperanza took her meals alone in the small sitting room adjacent to her quarters, served by silent maids who lowered their eyes when she tried to start any conversation. In the mornings, she walked through the corridors of the south wing, discovering empty rooms covered with white sheets, like ghosts of a social life that had once existed. In the afternoons, she sat by the window with her embroidery, observing the gardens that seemed to whisper stories of happier times. It was on one of those afternoons, when the setting sun had tinted the walls pale gold, that she saw him for the first time. A boy of about 12 was peeking through the crack of the half-open door. He had his father's dark, wavy hair, but his eyes possessed a melancholy that seemed too old for his age. When he realized he had been discovered, he quickly retreated. "Wait," said Esperanza softly, without getting up from the armchair. "You don't need to hide." The boy hesitated on the threshold, like a deer ready to flee at the slightest sudden movement. "You must be Diego," she continued, keeping her voice low and calm. "I am Esperanza." "I know who you are," he replied, finally entering the room. "Your papa's new wife." There was a wounded formality in those words, as if the boy had already learned that people entered and left his life without warning. "And you? How have you been spending these days?" asked Esperanza, setting her embroidery in her lap. Diego shrugged, slowly approaching the window. "Soledad says I shouldn't bother you, that you have your own concerns." "Soledad is wrong," said Esperanza, surprising herself with the firmness of her own voice. "You don't bother me at all." The boy observed her with curiosity, as if trying to decipher an enigma. "Papa said you're not like the other one." "The other one?" "Mama." She was very beautiful. She had dresses with stones that sparkled like stars. Esperanza felt a familiar pang in her chest, the pain of being constantly compared and always losing. But there was something in the way Diego observed her, without the cruel judgment of adults that calmed her. "And what do you like, Diego? Do you have any hobby or favorite game?" The boy's eyes lit up slightly. "I like animals. I have a lamb that I saved when it was born an orphan. Papa let me raise it. I would like to meet him someday." "Really?" The surprise in his voice broke Esperanza's heart, as if the idea that someone would be interested in his passions were completely new. They talked until the shadows took over the room. Diego told her about his lessons with the tutor, about the books he liked to read, about the secret places of the hacienda where he used to hide when loneliness weighed too much. When he said goodbye, Diego stopped at the door and turned. "Esperanza, may I come back tomorrow?" "Whenever you want," she replied, and for the first time since her arrival at El Mirador, her smile was genuine. That night, Esperanza lay down with a new sensation in her chest. Perhaps she wasn't loved in this house, but she could be useful. She could be important to someone who also knew the weight of solitude. But how would Don Alejandro react upon discovering the growing closeness between his new wife and his son? The first spring rain came on a March morning, bringing with it the perfume of awakened earth. Esperanza, who had developed the habit of walking through the gardens at dawn, stopped before what had once been a rose garden. The rose bushes, abandoned for years, had become wild. Some still struggled to bloom among the uncontrolled thorns, producing small and disheveled roses that no one cut to adorn the house vases. It was a garden of rejects, thought Esperanza, and perhaps that's why she felt so at home there. "The Senora shouldn't get dirty like this," said a voice behind her. Esperanza turned and found Petra, the elderly cook with white hair like cotton, who carried a basket of aromatic herbs. "Plants don't care about dirt," replied Esperanza, cleaning her hands on her skirt. "And neither do I." Petra studied her with perspicacious eyes that had already seen many springs. The former one never stepped in the garden, said it was work for laborers. "The former one was very wise then, because I clearly don't know what I'm doing," said Esperanza with a timid smile. To her surprise, Petra laughed, a low and warm sound that seemed long absent from those gardens. "You know more than you imagine, Senora. Dead plants don't bloom alone, and I already see new buds where yesterday there were only thorns." It was true. In recent days, Esperanza had begun to remove weeds, prune dead branches, water the plants that seemed to have the best chances of survival. It wasn't refined work. Her hands got dirty, her nails broke, her skirt was stained with earth. But there was a peace in that labor that she had never found in embroidery or prayers. "Could you teach me about local plants?" asked Esperanza. "I would like to plant some new flowers." Petra nodded, pointing to different areas of the garden. "Here, marigolds grow well. They are humble flowers, but resistant. Basil thrives in that sunny corner. And there, where the shade is denser, we could plant pansies. Humble but resistant flowers." Esperanza identified with that description. During the following weeks, she worked tirelessly in the garden. The hacienda workers, initially surprised to see the new Senora with her hands in the earth, began to respect her for her honest effort. Some offered tools, others brought seedlings from their own gardens, but not everyone looked favorably upon her dedication. Don Evaristo, the property administrator, a man with grey mustaches and insinuating manners, made increasingly acid comments. "The Senora should take care of house matters, not play at being a gardener," he said to whoever wanted to listen. "We already had a duchess who knew her place." Esperanza pretended not to hear, but the words hit her like thorns. Still, she continued her work. Each flower that sprouted seemed like a small victory against the contempt that surrounded her. Diego became her constant companion in the garden. The boy helped her plant seeds and watered the seedlings with devoted care. It was in the gardens that he talked about his mother, about the loneliness he felt since she died, about the nightmares that visited him on moonless nights. "She reminds me of Mama," confessed Diego one afternoon, watching Esperanza care for a particularly stubborn rosebush, not in appearance but in the way she cares about small things. Esperanza felt her heart tighten. "And what happened to your mother, Diego?" The boy was silent for a long moment, then whispered, "She got sick very quickly, a fever that no one could cure. Before dying, she said the gardens would be sad without her." "Then perhaps it's our mission to return joy to them," said Esperanza softly. That night she found a small note under her door. "Thank you for making Mama happy again." Diego. But how far could Esperanza get close to Alejandro's son before her intentions were questioned? The fever came at dawn in April, when the first roses in the garden were beginning to bloom. Esperanza awoke to screams coming from the corridor, altered voices, hurried steps, the clinking of metal utensils. Wearing only her robe over her nightgown, she left her quarters and found maids running from one side to the other, carrying basins of water and clean cloths. "What's happening?" she asked one of them. "It's young Don Diego, Senora. He's burning with fever. Don Alejandro was urgently called to Puebla to resolve problems with the harvest, and won't return before tomorrow." Esperanza didn't hesitate. She headed to the main wing of the house, territory that until then had been forbidden to her. Diego's room was situated on the second floor, in a spacious suite decorated with old maps and ship models. Diego was lying down, his cheeks flushed with fever, his hair stuck with sweat to his forehead. His eyes shone with a sickly brightness, and he murmured incomprehensible words. Soledad was at the foot of the bed, visibly anguished. "Senora, you shouldn't be here. When Don Alejandro returns..." Don Alejandro is not here, said Esperanza, with a firmness that surprised both of them. And the child needs care. She approached the bed and placed her hand on Diego's forehead. The fever was high but not dangerous if treated adequately. She asked them to bring fresh water, clean cloths and chamomile tea. "Diego," she whispered, sitting on the edge of the bed. "It's me, Esperanza. I'm here." The boy's eyes focused with difficulty on her face. "Esperanza, the flowers. The flowers are dying again." "No, my dear, the flowers are growing. Do you remember the marigolds we planted yesterday? They already have tiny buds." Throughout the night, Esperanza remained beside Diego. She changed the cloths on his forehead, gave him small sips of water, hummed lullabies she had learned from her own mother. When the fever rose, she embraced him gently, transmitting all the maternal tenderness she carried in her chest. In the early hours of morning, the fever subsided. Diego fell asleep peacefully, breathing normally. Esperanza leaned back in the armchair beside the bed, exhausted but relieved. That's how Alejandro found her when he returned at midday the next day. He entered the room hurriedly, still wearing travel clothes covered with dust. His eyes moved quickly from Diego, who slept placidly, to Esperanza, who had awakened, startled by his arrival. "How is he?" he asked, approaching the bed. "The fever passed. He slept peacefully since dawn." Alejandro placed his hand on his son's forehead, confirming that the temperature had normalized. Something indefinable passed across his face, relief, surprise, and something else that Esperanza couldn't identify. "You stayed with him all night?" "Yes." "Why?" The question sounded more curious than accusatory. Esperanza stood up, smoothing her wrinkled skirt. "Because he needed someone." "And because," she hesitated, then continued with a firm voice, "because if he were my son, I would want someone to care for him in my absence." Alejandro studied her in silence for a long moment. For the first time since the marriage, his eyes really saw her, not as a burden or an obligation, but as a person who had made a human and generous choice. "Thank you," he said finally, and there was something in his voice that she had never heard before. When Diego awoke, the first thing he said was, "Mama, are you better now?" The silence that followed was dense with meanings. Alejandro stiffened, and Esperanza felt her heart race. "Diego," she said softly, "I am Esperanza, remember?" But the boy smiled and repeated, "Mama," as if he were absolutely certain of what he was saying. Would this be the beginning of a new understanding between Esperanza and Alejandro, or the start of even greater tension? The weeks that followed Diego's fever brought subtle but perceptible changes in the atmosphere of El Mirador. Alejandro no longer completely avoided Esperanza's presence. Sometimes he found her in the gardens and made polite comments about the progress of the flowers. Diego, for his part, had begun to call Esperanza mother, with growing naturalness despite Soledad's disapproving looks. It was on a May afternoon, while exploring an old sewing room on the second floor, that Esperanza made the discovery that would change everything. The room was covered with dust, with faded fabrics hanging on faceless mannequins. In a corner, almost hidden by an oriental screen, there was a carved wooden desk. Esperanza opened it, moved by curiosity, and found threads, mother-of-pearl buttons, and at the bottom of the deepest drawer, a small box sealed with blue velvet ribbon. Inside the box, letters. Letters written in feminine and delicate calligraphy, signed Esperanza de la Torre, the first duchess who bore the same name as her. Esperanza sat on the dusty floor and began to read. The first letters were cheerful, full of plans to reform the gardens, detailed descriptions of the parties she intended to give, of the dresses she would have made in Mexico City. There was a contagious vitality in those words, a joy of living that leaped from the yellowed paper. But as the dates advanced, the tone changed. The letters became more introspective, more melancholic. The Duchess wrote about loneliness, about the difficulty of adapting to country life after the bustle of the capital, about the growing distance between her and Alejandro. "My dear husband seems to be always absent, even when he is present," she wrote in a letter dated 1849. "Sometimes I feel I married a shadow." Esperanza felt a tightness in her chest upon recognizing her own feelings mirrored in those words from 3 years ago. There was one letter that was sealed, different from the others. On the envelope, the same delicate calligraphy had written, "For Alejandro, Only open if something happens to me. Esperanza held the letter for a long moment, torn between curiosity and respect for others' privacy. Finally, she tucked it into her dress bodice. Some secrets need to wait for the right moment to be revealed. That night, during dinner, Alejandro made an unexpected observation. "Diego told me that you two have been spending a lot of time together." Esperanza put down her fork, preparing for the reprimand that would surely come. "If that bothers you—" "It doesn't bother me," he interrupted. I don't want him to create incorrect expectations." "What kind of expectations?" Alejandro hesitated, as if the words were difficult to form. "He calls you mother. This might confuse him about the nature of our marriage." "And what is the nature of our marriage, Alejandro?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from an extinguished candle. Alejandro observed her for a long moment before responding. "An arrangement of convenience, nothing more." "I understand," said Esperanza, returning to eat as if the words hadn't hit their target. "Then Diego must learn that he shouldn't expect affection where there is only convenience." "Esperanza, you don't need to explain. I would just like you to be clear with me about the limits I should respect, so that I don't create incorrect expectations either." Alejandro remained silent for the rest of the meal, but Esperanza noticed that he observed her differently, as if trying to solve an enigma that she represented. Later, alone in her quarters, Esperanza took the sealed letter from her bodice and examined it again. In the weak candlelight, she could see that the seal had been broken and then resealed with new wax. Someone had already read this letter. What secrets about the death of the first Duchess would be hidden in that sealed correspondence? The month of June brought with it an unexpected visit that made the entire Hacienda El Mirador move in a nervous dance of preparations. Doña Remedios de Morales y Vega had decided to personally verify how her niece was adapting to matrimonial responsibilities. Esperanza received the news with the same enthusiasm she would feel upon being informed of a hailstorm. She knew her aunt well enough to know that the visit was not motivated by family affection, but by malicious curiosity. Doña Remedios arrived in a golden carriage pulled by 4 white horses, accompanied by 3 maids and enough luggage for a stay of several weeks. She was a 50-year-old woman who had preserved her beauty at the cost of rigid discipline and expensive cosmetics. Her dresses were always in the latest Parisian fashion, her jewelry always impeccable, her smile always sharp as a blade. "Dear niece," she said, kissing the air near Esperanza's cheeks. "How different you look." "Different how, Tia?" "Oh, more rustic. The countryside has that effect on women. I hope you haven't completely lost your manners." Dinner was prepared in the main dining room with the crystal and silverware saved for special occasions. Alejandro, who rarely joined meals, made a point of being present to receive the illustrious visitor. "Don Alejandro," said Doña Remedios with her most charming smile, "what a joy to see you again under such happy circumstances. I must confess we were all surprised when we learned of your interest in our Esperanza." "Surprised?" asked Alejandro politely. "Well, considering the differences between her and your first wife. Esperanza was always more, how can I say, practical, less ornamental." Esperanza felt blood rise to her cheeks, but maintained a serene expression. She knew Doña Remedios's tactics and wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing her react. "The first Duchess was indeed an extraordinary creature," continued Doña Remedios, savoring each word as if it were expensive wine. "So beautiful, so refined. I imagine how difficult it must be for Esperanza to occupy the place of someone so unforgettable." "My current wife has her own qualities," said Alejandro, in a response that sounded more protocolar than defensive. "Oh, certainly. Esperanza was always very dedicated. I remember how she cared for the plants in our house's garden. Such an appropriate activity for her." The subtle cruelty of these words didn't go unnoticed by anyone at the table. Doña Remedios was making it clear that she considered Esperanza more suitable for manual work than for aristocratic salons. Diego, who had been introduced to the visitor before dinner, remained silent. But Esperanza noticed how he observed her with curiosity, as if trying to understand why that lady spoke about his mother with such falseness. "And how is the adaptation to married life, dear?" asked Doña Remedios directly to Esperanza. "I imagine it must be challenging. managing such a large house with so many social responsibilities. Actually, said Esperanza calmly, I have found great satisfaction in caring for the gardens. They were quite abandoned when I arrived. Oh yes, I heard you have been dedicating yourself personally to that work. How charming. The tone was that of someone praising a child for playing in mud. The tension at the table was palpable when Doña Remedios turned to Alejandro. I hope you'll forgive the curiosity of a concerned aunt, Don Alejandro, but has Esperanza adequately fulfilled your matrimonial expectations? The silence that followed was embarrassing. Alejandro slowly drank his wine before responding. My wife has proven to be adequate company. Adequate. The word echoed in Esperanza's mind like a slap. Not loved, not valued, not admired. Just adequate. How wonderful, exclaimed Doña Remedios. Adequate is all a woman can aspire to be, isn't it, dear? Esperanza met her aunt's eyes, and for the first time in her life, didn't lower her gaze. I believe, Tia, that a woman can aspire to be much more than adequate. She can aspire to be respected. The silence that followed was icy. Doña Remedios smiled, but there was poison in that smile. How charming, she murmured. Marriage has made my niece so brave. What other poisons would Doña Remedios spill during her visit, and what dangerous secrets might she be hiding? Doña Remedios's visit extended for 2 weeks that felt like 2 months. During this period, Esperanza noticed subtle changes in the behavior of the hacienda servants. Conversations were interrupted when she approached, silent glances were exchanged, and there was a tension in the air that hadn't existed before. On a stifling June night, when she had already retired to her quarters, Esperanza was awakened by low voices coming from the garden. She approached the window and saw 2 silhouettes conversing by the old stone well, Doña Remedios and Don Evaristo, the administrator. Her instincts told her to step away, but something in the conspiratorial posture of the two made her remain still, trying to catch fragments of the conversation. Truths that should be left where they are, murmured Evaristo's voice. Always knew there was more to that story, replied Doña Remedios. A woman doesn't die like that, so suddenly... Did Alejandro ever suspect anything? Men rarely see what they don't want to see. The wind changed direction, and the words were lost. Esperanza felt a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the night breeze. What truths were these that should remain hidden, and what relation did they have to the first Duchess's death? The next morning, Esperanza decided to explore more deeply the quarters that had belonged to the first Esperanza de la Torre. Under the pretext of looking for old fabrics to remake the curtains in her own rooms, she headed to the main bedroom that had remained closed since the Duchess's death. Soledad tried to stop her. Don Alejandro ordered that those quarters remain untouched, Senora. I'm only looking for fabrics that can be reused, said Esperanza firmly. It's a practical matter, not sentimental. The room was a mausoleum of luxury. Everything remained exactly as the Duchess had left it. Perfume bottles on the dressing table, jewelry scattered on a silver tray, even a book open on the bedside table. It was as if she had stepped out for a few minutes and would return at any moment. Esperanza moved carefully through the room, examining the belongings with respect. In the Duchess's personal library, she found a Bible with annotations in the margins. On a page from the Book of Job, a line was underlined, "The hidden shall flourish under the judgment of the righteous." Below the line, a note in the same delicate calligraphy she knew from the letters, "For Alejandro, if you ever desire the truth, look where light does not enter." Esperanza's heart accelerated. The first Duchess had left clues about some secret she wished to reveal to her husband. But where does light not enter? What place was that? That afternoon, when Doña Remedios had gone out for a ride around the property lands, Esperanza decided to explore the less used areas of the hacienda. She went down to the basement, a labyrinth of storage rooms and wine cellars that rarely received visits. In her exploration, she discovered a small room hidden behind the main cellar. The door was partially concealed by wine barrels and was only noticed because of a current of cold air that escaped through the crack. The room was small and dark, illuminated only by a high and narrow window. On the walls, framed portraits were covered with white cloths. Esperanza uncovered one of them and found herself facing a portrait of the first Duchess that she had never seen before. In this painting, she wasn't wearing the famous emeralds or sumptuous dresses. She was simply dressed with a melancholic expression in her eyes, and in her hands she held a folded paper. In the lower corner of the painting, a small golden plaque read, Esperanza de la Torre, The Truth Behind Beauty, 1850. Señora! Esperanza turned, startled. Evaristo was at the entrance to the room with a furious expression on his face. This area is forbidden. Don Alejandro was very clear about this. I don't care what you were doing. This room remains closed by order of the Duke, and if you were sensible, you wouldn't ask questions about things that don't concern you. There was a veiled threat in those words that made Esperanza retreat. But while Evaristo accompanied her back to the stairs, she managed to memorize every detail of that strange portrait. That night, lying in her bed, Esperanza thought about the words heard in the conversation between Doña Remedios and Evaristo, the annotation in the Bible, the hidden portrait in the basement. All these elements pointed to a truth about the first Duchess that someone was desperate to keep buried. What terrible secrets about the death of the first Esperanza de la Torre were being concealed, and what would be the price of discovering the truth? Doña Remedios's departure at the end of June brought palpable relief to the entire hacienda. But with her also went the last masks of civility. Don Evaristo became more vigilant and hostile, especially after the incident in the basement. Esperanza felt his eyes on her constantly, as if he expected her to make some fatal error. It was on a suffocating July afternoon that destiny decided to force the cards to the table. Esperanza was in the garden with Diego, teaching him to graft rose bushes, when one of the workers came running. "Fuego! Fire in the stables!" They ran toward the stables and saw the orange flames licking the wooden roof. The fire had started in the hay storage and was spreading quickly. The men formed a human chain to carry buckets of water from the well, but everyone knew it would be a lost battle. "My lamb!" shouted Diego suddenly. "Lucifer is trapped in the back corral." Before Esperanza could stop him, the boy ran toward the burning stable. Without hesitation, she followed him. The dense smoke made breathing almost impossible. Esperanza covered her nose and mouth with her skirt and followed Diego's screams. She found him in the back corral, desperately trying to open the gate that had jammed with the heat. "Diego, get out of here!" she shouted, but the boy refused to abandon the animal. A burning beam crashed a few meters from them. Esperanza managed to open the gate, freed the lamb and pushed Diego toward the exit. But on the way, another beam fell, blocking the main passage. "This way!" she shouted, guiding Diego toward a side window. She helped the boy through first, then tried to follow him. But her skirts got tangled in the wood fragments, and when she finally freed herself, the flames had already reached her left sleeve. She managed to jump through the window, rolling in the dirt to smother the fire on her clothes. Diego was safe and sound, still holding his lamb, but Esperanza felt intense pain in her left arm. That's when she saw Alejandro running toward her, his face transfigured by terror and relief. "Dios mío, Esperanza, are you all right?" For the first time since she had known him, she heard her name on his lips, charged with genuine concern. Alejandro examined her quickly, noticing the burns on her arm. "We need to take care of this immediately," he said, carrying her in his arms toward the house, followed by Diego, who was crying with relief and gratitude. In the days that followed, while Esperanza recovered from the burns, something fundamental changed between her and Alejandro. He personally cared for her bandages, brought her meals, sat beside her bed to read aloud. "Why did you do it?" he asked one of those quiet afternoons. "Why did you risk your life for Diego?" Esperanza observed him for a long moment before responding. "Because he is your son, and because I love him." "You love him?" "As if he were my own son. So I know this bothers you. I know it wasn't part of the arrangement, but I can't help it." Alejandro remained silent, looking through the window at the gardens she had transformed. "My first wife never showed particular affection for Diego," he said finally. "She fulfilled her stepmother duties but always maintained an educated distance." "And that pleased you?" "I thought it did. I thought it was simpler that way, cleaner, less complicated." "And now?" Alejandro turned to her, and for the first time Esperanza saw genuine vulnerability in his eyes. "Now I realize I spent my whole life confusing simplicity with coldness, and that perhaps I've been unfair to you from the beginning." "How so?" "You came to this house expecting to find at least basic respect, and I offered you only tolerance. You cared for my son as if he were yours, revitalized gardens I had abandoned to death, brought life where I had only left mourning, and I treated you as if you were a burden to be endured." Esperanza felt tears burning in her eyes. "Alejandro, I don't know if it's possible to mend what I broke," he continued. "I don't know if I can learn to be a real husband after having been only a puppet of social conveniences, but I would like to try, if you would allow me." For the first time in her life, Esperanza felt that someone really saw her, not as an inferior alternative to another person, not as a solution to a problem, but as she really was. "I would like that," she whispered. "But would this transformation be lasting? Or would there still be secrets from the past that could destroy this fragile hope of happiness?" Esperanza's recovery coincided with the August rains, which came abundant and noisy, washing away the summer dust and bringing a renewing coolness to the hacienda. During the long afternoons when she remained resting, Alejandro had become a constant companion. They read together, talked about plans for the property, and slowly discovered affinities that the arranged marriage had never allowed to reveal. It was on one of those afternoons, when the rain drummed gently on the windows, that Esperanza made the decision that would change everything. "Alejandro," she said, interrupting the reading he was doing aloud, "there's something I need to show you." She got up from the armchair and went to her dresser, from which she took the sealed letter she had found months before among the first Duchess's belongings. "What is this?" he asked, immediately recognizing his dead wife's handwriting. "I found it among her things. It's addressed to you with instructions to be opened only if something happened to her." Alejandro took the letter with slightly trembling hands. He examined the seal that had been broken and remade, then looked at Esperanza with a question in his eyes. "Did you read it?" "No, but I believe someone did." With slow and deliberate movements, Alejandro opened the envelope and unfolded the pages covered with the familiar handwriting. As he read, his expression transformed, first surprise, then incredulity, finally a cold fury that Esperanza had never seen in his eyes. "Dear God," he murmured, sinking into the armchair. "What does it say?" Alejandro looked at her for a long moment, as if debating with himself about how much to reveal. Finally, he began to read aloud. "My dear Alejandro, if you are reading this letter, my worst fears have been confirmed. I discovered something terrible about Don Evaristo that needs to be revealed. For months he has been embezzling funds from the hacienda, falsifying the accounting books, and secretly selling parts of our harvests at prices much lower than those recorded. When I confronted him, he threatened me, said that accidents happen to women who are too curious." Alejandro paused, his voice choked with emotion. "I'm afraid, Alejandro, Evaristo has allies I cannot identify, and I feel I'm being watched constantly. If something happens to me, please examine the books from the last year. You'll find the proof in the secret safe behind the portrait of San Isidro in the office. The secret is Diego's birth date. Forgive me for not telling you before. I wanted to be sure of the accusations before destroying a man with suspicions." The letter continued with expressions of love and requests for forgiveness for the suspicion and fear that had dominated her last months of life. When Alejandro finished reading, a dense silence settled in the room. The rain continued its melancholic music on the windows, but now it sounded like a requiem. "She knew," said Alejandro finally. "She knew and died before she could tell me. The fever that killed her, it wasn't natural fever. It couldn't have been." Esperanza felt a chill down her spine. "What will you do?" Alejandro stood up abruptly, the letter still in his hands. "I'm going to confront Evaristo, and I'm going to examine those books. Alejandro, wait. If she was right about him being dangerous, then it's time to end this once and for all." That night, Alejandro went down to the office and found the secret safe exactly where the letter indicated. The documents stored there confirmed every accusation. There were falsified records, receipts from secret sales, correspondence with buyers who offered below-market prices in exchange for discretion. Evaristo had stolen a fortune from the Della Torre family over 3 years. The next morning, Alejandro summoned the administrator for a meeting in the office. Esperanza, at her husband's request, waited in an adjacent room where she could hear the conversation. "Don Evaristo," said Alejandro with an icy voice, placing the documents on the table, "I believe you have some explanations to give." The silence that followed was dense with tension. Then Evaristo's voice, initially trying to sound indignant. "I don't know what you're talking about, Don Alejandro. I'm talking about 3 years of systematic theft. I'm talking about falsified books and secret sales. And I'm talking about my wife's death. Your wife died of fever. My wife died because she discovered your crimes and you killed her to silence her." What followed was a complete confession, extracted more by fear than by conscience. Evaristo admitted the embezzlement, the falsifications, even the gradual poisoning of the first Duchess with small doses of arsenic mixed into the medicine she took for headaches. "There was no choice," he finally screamed. "She was going to destroy everything. She was going to expose me." Alejandro immediately expelled him from the property, keeping the confessions and evidence to turn over to the authorities in Puebla. When Esperanza and Alejandro were alone, he collapsed in a chair, the weight of guilt and regret crushing his shoulders. 3 years, he murmured. 3 years she lived in fear, and I didn't even notice. Esperanza approached and placed her hand on his shoulder. "You didn't know." "I should have known. I should have paid attention. I should have been a better husband to her, as I'm trying to be for you. The past cannot be changed, Alejandro. But the future is still in our hands." Would it be possible for Alejandro to forgive himself and build a new life on the ruins of past guilts? 3 days after the revelation about Evaristo, Alejandro disappeared. Esperanza woke one September morning and discovered he had left before dawn, taking only his horse and some provisions. He had left a brief note. "I need time to think. I'll be back soon. A." Diego was inconsolable. "Papa won't come back, will he?" "Like Mama, he's also going away forever." Esperanza hugged the boy, trying to transmit a confidence she herself didn't feel. "He'll return. Sometimes adults need time alone to organize their thoughts." But days passed, then weeks, without news from Alejandro. Esperanza took over the administration of the hacienda, with help from Petra and the oldest workers, but the nights were long and full of uncertainties. It was Diego who finally provided the clue of where his father might be. "There's a cabin in the mountains where he used to go when Mama died," said the boy. "I followed him once, but he sent me back. He said it was his place to talk to God." Esperanza didn't hesitate. The next morning she dressed in riding clothes and followed Diego's directions. The trail serpentined through rocks and pines, constantly ascending until the hacienda became a tiny point in the valley. The cabin was rustic, built of stone and wood, with a single window that looked out on a precipice from which the entire valley of Puebla could be seen. Smoke escaped from the chimney, confirming that someone was inside. Esperanza knocked on the door and waited. When it opened, Alejandro appeared with an unshaven beard and wrinkled clothes. His expression went from surprise to concern. "Esperanza, what are you doing here? Did something happen to Diego?" "Diego is fine. I was the one who wasn't." She entered the cabin without waiting for an invitation. The interior was Spartan. A bed, a rustic table, a fireplace where a small fire burned. In recent weeks, Alejandro had clearly used this place to isolate himself from the world. "Why did you come?" he asked, closing the door. "Because you're my husband. Because Diego loves you and needs you. And because I need you too." Alejandro turned to the window, contemplating the valley. "I don't know how to be a good man anymore, Esperanza. I completely failed my first wife. I allowed her to be murdered because I was too busy being cold and distant to notice her fear. How can I guarantee I won't do the same to you?" Esperanza approached him. "Because now you know the price of indifference, because pain taught you to pay attention. And if it's not enough, and if I close myself off again, fail again, then I'll remind you to keep your eyes open. And you'll remind me that I deserve to be seen. We'll do this together." Alejandro turned to her, and Esperanza saw tears in his eyes. "I don't know if I deserve a second chance." "It's not about deserving," she said softly. "It's about choosing to be better than we were yesterday." They talked all afternoon. Alejandro spoke about his guilt, about how he had married the first Esperanza for her beauty and status, without ever trying to really know her. He spoke about how he had repeated the same mistake in the second marriage, treating her as an obligation to be fulfilled. Esperanza, for her part, spoke about years of feeling invisible, about accepting crumbs of affection because they told her it was all she deserved. She spoke about how she was learning to value herself, but needed a partner who also valued her. I want to establish some conditions, she said when the conversation deepened. If we return together to the hacienda. What conditions? I want to be treated as your equal, not as your subordinate. I want my opinions to be heard and considered. I want Diego to know he can count on me as a mother, without that being seen as a threat to the memory of the first wife. And I want you to promise to tell me when something worries you, instead of isolating yourself. Alejandro studied her for a long moment. And what do you offer in return? Honesty, loyalty, and the promise that I'll try to help you be the man you want to be. When the sun set over the mountains, they had reached an agreement. It wasn't a marriage of sweeping passion, but it was something perhaps more valuable, a partnership based on mutual respect and shared growth. There's one more thing, said Alejandro when they were already preparing to sleep. I want you to know that I'm beginning to love you, not in the dramatic way of novels, but in a solid and true way. And that scares me. Esperanza smiled for the first time in weeks. It scares me too, but maybe it's good to be afraid of what's worth preserving. The next morning, they descended together to the hacienda, leaving behind not only the solitude of the mountain, but also the ghosts that had haunted them. Would it be possible to build true love on the foundations of a marriage that began as mere convenience? 8 years later, spring 1860. The morning sun danced between the jacaranda leaves when Esperanza walked through what was now known throughout the region as the Garden of Those Who Were Not Beautiful. What had begun as a personal recovery project had transformed into something much larger, a symbol of dignity for women who, like her, had been rejected by conventional standards of beauty. At 27, Esperanza had flourished in a way she had never imagined possible, not in the sense of having suddenly become beautiful by society's standards, but of having found her own beauty that radiated confidence and purpose. Her hair, now always tied with colorful ribbons, framed a face that had learned to smile genuinely. Her hands, calloused by work in the earth, held life firmly. The Hacienda El Mirador had been completely transformed. Where once reigned the silence of a mausoleum, now echoed voices of women and children who came for the classes that Esperanza offered free of charge. In the main hall, which had remained closed for years, peasant women learned to read and write. In the former sewing room of the first Duchess, young mothers learned trades that would allow them to support their families. "Mama, the wildflowers are ready for harvest," said Isabel, who at 15 had inherited her mother's passion for gardens along with her quiet determination. Esperanza smiled at her daughter, not biologically, but in all the ways that mattered. After the reconciliation with Alejandro, Carmen had arrived, now 12 years old and full of the vivacity that the other two women of the house expressed more discreetly. "And Carmen?" asked Esperanza, noticing the youngest's absence. "She's with Papa at the stables, trying to convince him to let her train the new colt," replied Isabel with an amused smile. Diego, now a young man of 20, had become Alejandro's quiet pride. He had studied administration in Mexico City, but chose to return to help modernize the hacienda's operations. More importantly, he had completely embraced Esperanza's social projects, often serving as a bridge between the conservative traditions of the older workers and the innovations she proposed. Esperanza was walking among the flower beds when she saw a carriage approaching along the main road. She immediately recognized the golden coat of arms, Doña Remedios. She hadn't seen her aunt for 5 years, since the woman had tried to interfere in Carmen's education, insisting that a duke's daughter shouldn't learn manual trades alongside common children. Alejandro, to everyone's surprise, had emphatically defended his wife and requested that Doña Remedios not visit the hacienda again, while she didn't respect the family's decisions. "Esperanza," Alejandro's voice came from the main terrace. At 43, he had found a balance between natural authority and the humanity he had learned from his wife. His hair was beginning to whiten at the temples, which only accentuated the dignity of his bearing. "I saw the carriage," said Esperanza, joining him. "What do you think she wants after all this time?" "I imagine we'll find out soon." Doña Remedios descended from the carriage with the same elegance as always, but Esperanza noticed that the years had taken their toll. Her aunt was thinner, harder, and there was something desperate in her studied, gracious gestures. "Esperanza, dear," she said, kissing the air near her niece's cheeks. Prosperous you look." The word sounded as if it left a bitter taste in her mouth. "Tia," replied Esperanza politely, "what a surprise to see you here." "Well, I ended up returning from Mexico, permanently. Things changed a lot there, and I thought perhaps it was time to reconnect with family." Alejandro greeted the visitor with cold courtesy. "Doña Remedios, I hope your journey was peaceful." During lunch, served on the terrace overlooking the flowering gardens, the tension was palpable. Doña Remedios tried to keep the conversation on superficial topics, but her observations revealed a woman who had lost much of her social influence. "I see you still maintain your gardening activities," she said, observing a group of women working in the distant flower beds. "I don't just maintain them," replied Esperanza calmly. "I've expanded them. Now we have an education program that serves more than 50 families in the region." "How charitable," said Doña Remedios, with the same tone she would use to comment on someone feeding stray cats. It was Carmen who, with the devastating innocence of 12 years, asked the question that was in the air. "Tia Remedios, why do you always talk as if helping people was something bad?" The silence that followed was embarrassing. Doña Remedios tried to smile, but the effort was visible. "It's not bad, dear, just there are more appropriate ways to do charity, ways that preserve the necessary social distinctions." "What distinctions?" asked Carmen, genuinely curious. Alejandro intervened gently. "Carmen, how about showing Tia Remedios your botanical drawings?" Later, when the children had withdrawn and Doña Remedios finally revealed the true reason for her visit, everything became clear. "I need financial help," she admitted, finally abandoning pretenses. "I invested poorly in Mexico, lost almost everything. I thought perhaps that the family—" The irony was palpable. The woman who had spent years despising Esperanza was now asking for help precisely from the person she had tried to humiliate. "We'll see what we can do," said Alejandro diplomatically. When Doña Remedios left the next day, with a small amount to establish herself decently in Puebla, Esperanza and Alejandro walked together through the gardens at sunset. "Do you think she'll change?" asked Esperanza. "I don't know. But we have changed, and that's what matters." They stopped before a special rose bush, the first that Esperanza had planted upon arriving at the hacienda, now mature and exuberant. "Do you know what I'm most proud of?" said Alejandro, embracing his wife around the waist. "What?" "That our daughters grew up knowing that a person's value isn't measured by their appearance or origin, but by their kindness and determination. That's a legacy no fortune can buy." Esperanza smiled, watching Isabel and Carmen playing with the other children on the lawn. The Garden of the Rejected had become a place where beauty was redefined daily. What future awaited this family that had learned to flourish where others saw only barren land? Spring 1861. The letter arrived on a March morning that promised to be like any other. Esperanza was in the office, reviewing monthly reports from the education program, when Soledad entered carrying the official correspondence. "A letter from the governor of Puebla, Señora," said the housekeeper, who had gradually become an ally after witnessing the positive transformations at the hacienda. Esperanza opened the envelope with curiosity and read the contents twice before she could fully understand what was written. It was an invitation, or perhaps a disguised summons, for her and Alejandro to participate in a special hearing about unregulated educational activities on rural properties. Esperanza's heart accelerated. In recent months, there had been rumors that some aristocratic families in Puebla were uncomfortable with the example that El Mirador represented. Esperanza's educational project had inspired other women in the region to question their place in society, and this didn't please everyone. "Problems?" asked Alejandro, entering the office with Diego. Esperanza handed him the letter without saying anything. While he read, she observed the expressions that succeeded each other on his face. First confusion, then understanding, finally an iron determination that she had learned to recognize. "They want to intimidate us," he said simply. "Papa, what is it about?" asked Diego, taking the letter from his father's hands. "Some powerful men in Puebla believe your mother is being a bad influence," explained Alejandro with bitter irony. "Teaching women to read and think for themselves, imagine that." "And what will we do?" asked Esperanza. "We'll go to this hearing," said Alejandro firmly, "and we'll defend our rights and our principles." The trip to Puebla was tense. Esperanza wore her best dress, a simple but elegant navy blue silk model that enhanced her natural dignity. Alejandro wore his dress uniform, reminding everyone that his family had enough history and tradition to face any challenge. The hearing was held in the government palace, in an imposing room where local authorities and some influential landowners waited. Esperanza recognized some faces. Don Sebastian Herrera, a landowner known for his cruelty to workers; Doña Carlota Mendez, a rich widow who prided herself on maintaining the natural order of things; and, to her unpleasant surprise, Don Evaristo. The former administrator was visibly in financial difficulties. His clothes were of inferior quality, his face showed signs of excessive drinking, but his eyes shone with the hatred of someone who had lost everything. The governor, a middle-aged man with affectedly cordial manners, opened the session. Don Alejandro, Doña Esperanza, thank you for answering our invitation. We are here to discuss certain concerns about the activities being carried out on your property. What concerns exactly? Asked Alejandro with controlled voice. Don Sebastian stood up. The concerns of respectable citizens who see the social order being subverted by dangerous experiments. Peasant women being taught to read, children of different social classes mixed as if they were equals, revolutionary ideas being planted in simple minds. Revolutionary ideas like literacy? Asked Esperanza politely. Don't be ironic, Señora, intervened Doña Carlota. We know very well that your activities go beyond simple education. You're teaching women to question their husbands, to challenge established authority. I'm teaching women to read and learn trades that allow them to support their families, corrected Esperanza. If this results in questioning, perhaps the problem is in what's being questioned, not in who questions. It was then that Evaristo stood up, swaying slightly. Gentlemen, I knew this woman intimately. I know what kind of person she really is. Manipulative, ambitious, capable of anything to gain power. Alejandro also stood up, controlled fury radiating from him like heat. Careful with your words, Evaristo. Let's not forget that you were expelled from my property for theft and other serious accusations. Accusations that were never proven in court, shouted Evaristo. Because you fled before they could be formally presented, replied Alejandro coldly. The governor banged his gavel, trying to restore order. Gentlemen, ladies, let's maintain civility. Don Alejandro, Doña Esperanza, would you like to respond to the concerns raised? Esperanza stood up slowly. For a moment she felt the weight of all the gazes in the room, some hostile, others curious, a few sympathetic. She thought of all the women who had passed through her courses, of her daughters who were growing up knowing they could be anything they wanted to be, of Diego who had become a man who respected men and women equally. Gentlemen, she began with a clear and firm voice, I have been accused of subverting the social order. I accept this accusation with pride, if by social order you understand a system where half the population is kept in ignorance just for being born women. I have been accused of planting dangerous ideas, and I accept this too, if by dangerous ideas you understand the notion that every person deserves dignity and opportunity for growth. She paused, observing the tense faces before her. For years I was considered inadequate by this society's standards, too ugly, too humble, too insignificant. But I discovered that there's a beauty in refusing to accept the limits that others impose on us. There's strength in transforming rejection into purpose. Pretty words, interrupted Don Sebastian, but what matter are the results. And the results of your activities are women who no longer know their place, destabilized families, destroyed traditions. The results, said Esperanza, raising her voice, are women who can better educate their children because they know how to read. They are families that prosper because they have more sources of income. They are children who grow up knowing their value doesn't depend on the cradle they were born in. Alejandro joined his wife. My property is more prosperous today than it ever was. My workers are more loyal because they are treated with dignity. My family is happier because we learned that true love is built on mutual respect, not on domination. The debate continued for hours. In the end, the governor announced that there was no legal basis to interrupt the educational activities at El Mirador, as long as they remained within the property limits and were voluntary. When they left the palace, Esperanza and Alejandro walked in silence through the stone streets of Puebla. Finally, he stopped and turned to her. Do you have any idea what you just did? He asked. I hope I defended our principles. You did much more than that. You declared war on an entire system, and you did it with eloquence that would have made any lawyer proud. Esperanza smiled timidly. I learned from the best teacher, experience. And now? We know we'll have enemies, people who will try to harm us. Now we continue doing what's right, and we face the consequences together. Alejandro kissed her right there in the middle of the street, not caring who might be watching. Would this moral victory be enough to protect the future they had built, or would the enemies they made find other ways to attack? 5 years later, spring 1866. The bell of San Jose Church chimed softly in the morning breeze when Esperanza took her daily walk through the gardens of El Mirador. At 33, she carried in her eyes the serenity of someone who had found her place in the world, not by conforming to imposed standards, but by creating her own criteria of value. The hacienda had become an informal pilgrimage center for women from all over central Mexico. What had begun as a simple literacy project had evolved into something much larger, a school recognized by the federal government, a professional training center, and, most importantly, a symbol that social transformation was possible when based on dignity and honest work. Diego, now 25, had married Elena, a young teacher he met in Mexico City who shared the family's ideals. Isabel, at 20, had chosen to follow her mother's footsteps and directed the educational program for children. Carmen, at 17, was preparing to study medicine, a choice that scandalized some conservative families, but had the total support of her parents. "Mama," said Carmen, approaching Esperanza in the central garden, "a very special letter arrived." Esperanza took the envelope with curiosity. It was from Mexico City, with the official seal of the Ministry of Education. When she read the contents, she needed to sit on the stone bench near the fountain. "What does it say?" asked Carmen, noticing her mother's astonished expression. "It's an invitation for me to participate in a national commission on rural female education. They want to use our program as a model for other regions of the country." "Mama, that's wonderful." Esperanza reread the letter, still incredulous. 20 years before, when she arrived at El Mirador as a rejected and unwanted bride, she had never imagined that her simple ideas about dignity and education could reach national scope. Alejandro appeared coming from the stables, still wearing his work clothes. At 51, he had found a perfect balance between the natural authority of his position and the humanity he had learned from his wife. His hair was now completely grey, which only accentuated the dignity of his bearing. "What expression is that?" he asked, noticing Esperanza's perplexed face. Carmen handed him the letter with a radiant smile. Alejandro read it in silence, then looked at his wife with evident pride. "Do you know what this means?" he said finally. "That I'll have to go to the capital and talk to important politicians about things that always seemed simple to me," replied Esperanza, with a nervous smile. "It means that 20 years of honest work have borne fruit in a way we never dreamed possible." That afternoon, while they prepared the response to the letter, another unexpected visitor arrived. An elderly and elegant man who introduced himself as Don Ricardo Vasquez, director of the newspaper El Progreso from Mexico City. "Señora de la Torre," he said after formal introductions, "I came here because I'm writing a series of articles about women who are transforming modern Mexico. Your work at El Mirador has been the subject of conversations in progressive circles in the capital. I don't do anything extraordinary," protested Esperanza. "I just teach women to read and develop practical skills." "With all respect, Señora, that is revolutionary in itself. May I interview you?" During the conversation that followed, Don Ricardo asked perceptive questions about the evolution of the educational project, about the obstacles faced, about the reaction of local society. When he asked about her personal motivations, Esperanza hesitated before responding. "Throughout my youth, I was considered inadequate by society's standards of beauty and elegance. I learned there were two options: accept that evaluation and live as a shadow, or question who had established those standards and why. And which did you choose?" "I chose to create my own standards. I discovered there's a particular beauty in refusing to be diminished. There's elegance in working with one's own hands. There's value in caring for those who need it, even if that's not considered refined. And your relationship with your husband, how did it evolve?" Esperanza looked at Alejandro. who was listening to the interview from the other side of the terrace. "I learned that it's not necessary to be loved despite our imperfections, but because of our authenticity." And he learned that a marriage based on mutual respect is more lasting than one based only on attraction or convenience. When the interview ended and Don Ricardo left, promising to send a copy of the article when it was published, Esperanza and Alejandro walked together through the gardens at sunset. "Do you have any regrets?" he asked suddenly. "About what?" "About marrying me. About coming to a life you didn't choose." Esperanza stopped and turned to him. "My life began when I arrived here. Before that I only existed, trying to fit into molds that would never suit me. Here I learned I can create my own way of being." "And what will you tell the women who come seeking your advice? What's the main message?" Esperanza thought for a moment, observing the flowers she had planted with her own hands decades before and that now grew exuberantly. "I'll tell them they don't need to be beautiful to be loved, but they need to be authentic. They don't need to be perfect to be valuable, but they need to be brave. And that there's always someone who will try to convince us we're inadequate. Our mission is to prove they're wrong." 5 years later, when Don Ricardo's article was republished in anthologies about influential women of the 19th century, the phrase that became most cited was one that Esperanza had pronounced almost as a whisper. "I learned that true beauty isn't in being admired by crowds, but in being respected by those who really know us." And that genuine love doesn't ask to be begged. It simply recognizes our value and celebrates it. Esperanza Morales de la Torre never became a conventional beauty. She never wore magnificent jewelry or Parisian dresses. She never was the subject of passionate sonnets or inspired duels for her love. But she became something perhaps more valuable. She became unforgettable. Her garden of the rejected continued to flourish long after her steps fell silent. Her students became teachers. Her ideas spread to other provinces. Her story inspired generations of women who refused to accept the limits imposed by societies that didn't know how to recognize their value. And when Diego, already elderly, told the story of his mother to his own grandchildren, he always ended the same way. "She taught us that it's not necessary to be the most showy flower in the garden to make the world more beautiful. Sometimes the humblest flowers are the ones that perfume the air the longest." On the simple white marble tombstone in the San Jose Cemetery, only one inscription: Esperanza Morales de la Torre, 1833-1889. She planted gardens where others saw barren land.